We've got some excerpts from a lecture on the Enlightenment that we're looking at today.
Oh, cool.
In 1716, two women in England, they were the last people to be victims of witch hunts. It's a chilling reminder of how, for centuries, people just saw justice
As God's will. Right.
Exactly. It was like if you were accused of witchcraft back then, divine intervention was your only hope.
You got all these scriptural interpretations, an eye for an eye, and those actually formed the basis of legal practices.
And then there's trial by ordeal. It's like you'd have to plunge your arm into boiling water to prove you were innocent.
These practices, they seem barbaric now, but back then, it was a totally different understanding of truth and justice. It wasn't about evidence or logic. It was all about appeasing a higher power.
It makes you wonder how anyone survived back then. But there's something interesting here. Amidst all these trials by fire, literally a new idea started to emerge. The presumption of innocence.
Right, and that's where the Enlightenment really comes in.
Instead of assuming guilt, you assume innocence until proven otherwise. It was a huge shift, moving away from divine judgment toward human reason as the basis of justice.
Totally.
And no one embodies this shift better than Voltaire.
A key figure in the French Enlightenment.
But his life is actually a crazy story. He had this run-in with a nobleman and ended up exiled to England.
That it became this turning point in his intellectual journey.
Voltaire didn't just sit around feeling sorry for himself. He used his time in exile wisely and wrote his famous letters concerning the English nation.
He used them to subtly critique French society, highlighting all the advancements and freedoms he observed in England.
It was actually a pretty clever way to challenge the status quo.
Without directly confronting the French authorities, right?
He was like an 18th century influencer or something, using his platform to spread new ideas, and he was really captivated by the Quakers.
Yeah, he was drawn to their simple lifestyle, their religious tolerance, and how they rejected this rigid hierarchy.
It was like he saw in them a model for a more just and equitable society, which was a far cry from what France was like at the time. So by praising the Quakers, he was actually subtly critiquing French Catholicism, right?
I think so.
Pretty clever. He was big on learning from other cultures.
In his letters, he talks about everything from their system of inoculation against smallpox to Sir Isaac Newton. He thought Newton was the greatest man who ever lived.
And speaking of groundbreaking thinkers, we've got to talk about Diderot and D'Alembert.
Oh, yeah.
These guys were on a mission to democratize knowledge with their big project, the Encyclopedia.
It was huge. This revolutionary undertaking to compile knowledge from every field and make it accessible to everyone. A direct challenge to the traditional gatekeepers of information, like the church and the aristocracy.
It's amazing how all these Enlightenment thinkers were so interconnected. Diderot and D'Alembert dedicated their encyclopedia to Bacon, Locke, and Newton.
The same thinkers who deeply influenced Voltaire.
Exactly.
It shows how ideas were crossing borders, influencing everyone.
The Enlightenment wasn't confined to just one country.
It was a dynamic exchange of ideas, transforming the intellectual landscape of Europe.
Okay, so we've got reason, progress, a thirst for knowledge. It's all driving the Enlightenment. But we can't forget about the Counter-Enlightenment.
Right.
This whole movement challenged everything the Enlightenment stood for.
And things get really interesting here. We're talking about thinkers like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who, while very much a product of his time, had some radically different views, especially on progress.
And then you've got the French Revolution erupting in 1789.
Talk about a clash of ideologies.
You've got the aristocracy clinging to tradition, the liberals pushing for reform, and then the Jacobins, inspired by Rousseau, ushering in a reign of terror.
It was a chaotic time.
Rousseau, even though we consider him a modern thinker, actually opposed a lot of Enlightenment ideals.
It's true.
He championed individual liberty. But he also believed in a very powerful state.
He was wary of progress.
He was afraid that civilization was corrupting human nature.
He said, man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains.
It's a good reminder that even within the Enlightenment, there were some deep disagreements about freedom and progress.
And that's what made studying the Enlightenment so fascinating. It wasn't some simple, straightforward movement. It was a dynamic conversation, full of different voices. It's interesting, this whole tension between embracing progress, but also being afraid of what it might bring. It wasn't just Rousseau who felt that way. Even those in the thick of the Enlightenment, they grappled with these questions too.
Give me an example.
Our source mentions this fascinating episode in 1780. The Berlin Academy of Sciences, a huge center of Enlightenment thought, they decided to hold this essay contest.
Okay. Sounds pretty straightforward. What was the topic?
The question they asked was simple on the surface, but
Yeah.
when you really think about it, it was super provocative. Is it expedient to deceive the people?
Wow. So you've got this institution that's dedicated to reason, knowledge, all that.
And they're questioning the very idea of truth.
It seems like a recipe for disaster, honestly.
It really shows these anxieties that were bubbling beneath the surface of the Enlightenment. Here's this movement that's all about individual reason, autonomy. But even the people who are part of it are asking, what if the masses aren't ready for that much freedom?
Maybe not everyone's equipped to think for themselves.
Yeah, I see what you mean. It's like, where do you even draw the line once you start down that road? Questioning the value of truth, it's like a slippery slope. And that's what makes this whole essay contest so significant. It marks a real turning point where those foundations of the Enlightenment, the unwavering belief in reason and progress, they're starting to be questioned, even by the people who helped build them.
Yeah, that's a good point. It reminds you that history is never really neat and tidy.
Totally.
It's messy, it's full of contradictions, it's always evolving.
And that's what makes exploring these periods so interesting.
You get this glimpse into the minds of these incredible thinkers, grappling with huge questions that are still relevant today. It's like we're having this conversation across centuries trying to figure out the world and our place in it.
Speaking of incredible thinkers, this brings us to another giant of the era, David Hume.
Oh, a Scottish philosopher. He really threw a wrench into the Enlightenment machine, didn't he?
Did.
He was a radical empiricist, right? Believed that all knowledge comes from experience.
Exactly. And he was skeptical of everything. Cause and effect, the external world, even the idea of a persistent. Hume argued that you can't really know anything for sure beyond your own immediate sensations.
And that challenged the Enlightenment, because they seemed pretty into reason.
Hume's point was that reason on its own couldn't be the sole basis for morality.
Didn't he say something like, reason is and ought only to be the slave of the passions?
He did.
If reason isn't the source of morality, then what is?
That is the question, isn't it? The million-dollar question. Hume believed it all came down to sentiment, to our natural feeling.
Feelings, huh?
He said that our moral judgments come from our emotions, our empathy, our dislike of pain and suffering, things like that.
That's a pretty different view from the whole reason above all else thing.
This is where it gets even more interesting.
Okay.
So now we've got this three-way debate happening in the late 18th century. You've got the Enlightenment thinkers, they're all about reason and progress. Then you've got your Counter-Enlightenment figures like Hume and Rousseau.
They're questioning the foundation of those ideas.
And then, of course, you've got the traditional conservatives who are sticking to their established view.
Holding on tight.
It was a wild time. And it's right in this intellectual melting pot that modern philosophy as we know it really starts to take shape.
So much change and upheaval.
It was a time when all those old certainties were being challenged and new ideas were popping up everywhere.
It makes you wonder, with all these different viewpoints, can we really say that any one side was right and the others were wrong?
That's a great question.
Or is it more complicated than that? Is progress less about being right or wrong and more about this nuanced and complex journey? It's like we've gone on this crazy journey from those early trials, literally by fire, to this whole debate about reason and passion and where our understanding of it all breaks down.
And that journey didn't just stop back then. It still shapes so much of our world today. Think about it. All those ideas from the Enlightenment and the people who challenged it, they're woven into how we talk about rights, the role of government, even things like AI and ethics.
It's mind-blowing when you think about it, how these debates from centuries ago still feel so relevant, even in this digital age.
Our source points out that just when you think you've got a handle on all this back and forth, another figure emerges to bring those seemingly opposite sides together.
You're talking about Immanuel Kant.
Exactly.
Considered one of the most important figures in modern philosophy, and for good reason.
Absolutely. Kant comes along, and he's trying to bridge this gap between reason, which the Enlightenment was all about, and the role of emotions, experience, all that stuff the Counter-Enlightenment focused on.
So instead of picking a side, he's trying to find this middle ground.
Kant believed in reason, absolutely, but he also recognized that it had limits. He said, our minds aren't just empty containers waiting to be filled with information. We're not passive. We actually use these pre-existing categories of understanding to shape how we see the world.
How does this all connect back to what we've been talking about?
Kant believed that morality wasn't something we just discover out there in the world, like Hume argued.
Okay.
He said it comes from within, from this universal moral law.
Okay, you're going to have to break that one down for me. What did he mean by that?
We should only act in ways that we'd be okay with everyone else acting.
Interesting.
Imagine if everyone followed that rule. Would it create the kind of world you'd want to live in?
I see. So it's not just about what I want, but what's right for everyone.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Kant believed that if we used reason to figure out these universal moral laws, we could create a truly just and ethical society.
It's amazing to see how this all fits together. Like all these thinkers wrestling with big questions. Those questions are still shaping how we see justice, how we see morality, how we even think about making a better world.
The power of these ideas, they endure.
They really do. And I feel like even with everything we've covered today, we're just scratching the surface. So to our listeners, think about everything we've discussed today. What ideas resonated with you? What questions do you have? Because at the end of the day, that's what this is all about, right? Engaging with these ideas, grappling with these questions, because they matter. They matter for how we understand the world and how we choose to move through it.